had arranged a $9 million transfer for my son and daughter-in-law to buy their dream house. The day before, during family dinner, she introduced me to her parents. "This is the useless woman we support." I simply replied, "Open this envelope when you're alone." Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I still remember the exact moment my heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was 7:30 on a Tuesday evening, and I was sitting at Anthony's dining table, the same table I'd helped him buy when he moved in with Chloe 3 years ago. The mahogany gleamed under the chandelier I'd given them as a housewarming gift, and the crystal glasses, my grandmother's set that I'd passed down to them, caught the light beautifully. Everything in that house bore traces of my generosity, my love, my desperate hope that I was building something meaningful with my son and his wife. How naive I was. "Mom, I want you to meet Chloe's parents," Anthony said, his arm wrapped around his wife's waist. "Margaret and Robert just flew in from Denver." I smiled warmly, extending my hand to the elegant couple across from me. Margaret had Chloe's sharp features but softened by years of comfortable living, while Robert carried himself with the quiet confidence of a successful businessman. They looked like the kind of people who summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Aspen. "It's wonderful to finally meet you both," I said, genuinely meaning it. "Chloe talks about you constantly." That's when it happened. That's when my daughter-in-law looked directly at her parents, gestured casually toward me with her wine glass, and said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "This is the useless one we support." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my face drain of color, my hand still extended foolishly in the air between Margaret and me. The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, though it probably lasted only seconds. Margaret's eyebrows raised slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing her features before she quickly composed herself. Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. Anthony did nothing. Said nothing. Just stood there, his arm still around Chloe's waist, as if his wife hadn't just delivered the cruelest blow I'd ever received. I started, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. What could I say? How could I respond to such deliberate cruelty? Chloe continued as if nothing had happened, launching into some story about their recent vacation to Cabo, the one I'd paid for, of course. The conversation swirled around me while I sat there, stunned, trying to process what had just occurred. Support me? I supported them. For the past 3 years, I'd been writing checks to cover their mortgage when Anthony's consulting business hit rough patches. I'd paid for Chloe's dental work when her insurance wouldn't cover the cosmetic procedures she insisted she needed. I'd bought groceries, paid utility bills, covered car repairs, and even funded their romantic getaways. Just last month, I'd approved a $9 million transfer to help them buy their dream house, a sprawling estate in the hills with a pool and a 3-car garage. $9 million. Nearly half of everything I had left from Harold's life insurance and our investments. Money I'd planned to use for my retirement, for my care as I aged, for emergencies I couldn't yet foresee, but none of that mattered in that moment. What mattered was the casual cruelty in Chloe's voice, the way she'd reduced me to nothing more than a burden in front of strangers. What mattered was my son's silence, his complete failure to defend the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him. I excused myself quietly, mumbling something about needing the restroom. In Anthony's guest bathroom, the one with the Italian marble I'd helped them afford, I stared at myself in the mirror. 64 years old, silver hair carefully styled, wearing the navy dress I'd bought specifically for this dinner because I wanted to make a good impression on Chloe's parents, the useless one we support. My hands were shaking as I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope I'd prepared that morning. It was cream-colored stationery, heavy and expensive, with my initials embossed in gold, a small indulgence Harold had always encouraged me to maintain. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 5 words written in my careful handwriting. I'd planned to give it to Chloe privately, maybe at the end of the evening when we were saying our goodbyes. But something about that moment, about the deliberate humiliation she'd subjected me to, made me change my mind. When I returned to the dining room, the conversation had moved on to Robert's golf game. I waited for a lull, then approached Chloe's chair. She looked up at me with that same fake smile she'd perfected over the years, the one that fooled everyone except, apparently, me. "Chloe, dear," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, "could you do me a favor? Open this envelope when you're alone." I placed it beside her plate, gave Anthony a kiss on the cheek. He felt stiff under my touch, and gathered my purse. "Thank you for a lovely dinner," I told Margaret and Robert, who both seemed relieved that the awkward evening was ending. Nobody walked me to the door. Nobody asked if I was feeling well or if I needed anything. I let myself out, just as I'd been letting myself out of their lives for months without realizing it. In my car, parked under the streetlight, Anthony had convinced the city to install for better security, another expense I'd helped with. I sat in the darkness and finally allowed myself to cry. Deep, silent sobs that shook my shoulders and made my chest ache. 24 hours later, I would cancel the $9 million transfer. But that night, driving home through empty streets to my modest apartment, all I could think about was the envelope I'd left behind and the 5 words it contained: the transfer has been cancelled. 3 days passed before Anthony called. 3 days of silence that spoke louder than any accusation could have. When my phone finally rang that Friday morning, I was sitting in my kitchen, stirring honey into my tea and watching the sunrise through my small window. The same sunrise I'd watched alone for the past 5 years since Harold's death. "Mom, we need to talk." Anthony's voice was tight, strained in a way that reminded me of when he was 12 and had broken Mrs. Henderson's window with his baseball. That I took a slow sip of my tea, buying myself a moment. "Good morning to you too, sweetheart. Don't play games with me. What did that note mean? What transfer?" For a moment, I considered pretending I didn't know what he was talking about. But I was tired of pretending, tired of making excuses for behavior that had no excuse. "The $9 million, I said simply. "For your dream house." The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Then, quietly, "You cancelled it?" "Yes." "Why?" Such a small word for such a complicated question. Why? Because after 35 years of motherhood, I'd finally realized that love shouldn't feel like bleeding. Because I'd spent 5 years since Harold's death pouring my heart and my savings into a son who saw me as nothing more than an ATM. Because his wife had called me useless in front of strangers, and he'd stood there like it was perfectly normal, but I didn't say any of that. Instead, I found myself transported back to a humid August morning 26 years ago, when everything changed. "Do you remember when your father died?" I asked. "Mom, what does that have to do with, you were 9 years old," I continued, not letting him deflect. "Do you remember what happened after the funeral?" I could hear him breathing on the other end, could almost see him running his free hand through his hair the way he did when he was frustrated. It was a gesture he'd inherited from Harold, along with his stubborn streak and his tendency to shut down when confronted with difficult emotions. "You went back to work," he said finally. "I went back to 3 jobs, I corrected him. "The insurance money was good, but not good enough to maintain the life your father had built for us. Not good enough to keep you in private school, to pay for your tennis lessons, your computer camp, your college fund." The memories came flooding back, as vivid as if they'd happened yesterday. The alarm clock set for 4:30 in the morning. So I could be at the hospital by 5:30 for my shift as a nurse's aide. The way my feet ached after 12 hours of walking on linoleum floors, emptying bedpans and changing sheets. The drive across town to my second job at the department store, selling jewelry to women who spent more on a single necklace than I made in a month. "I worked 60 hours a week," I told Anthony, watching a neighbor walking her dog in the courtyard below. "Sometimes 70. "Do you know what I did with my evenings off?" He didn't answer. "I cleaned houses. Mrs. Garrett on Maple Street, the Johnsons on Elm. 3 houses, every Tuesday and Thursday night, so you could stay in that expensive school with your friends. So you wouldn't have to change your life just because your father was gone." The cleaning jobs had been the hardest. Not physically, though scrubbing other people's toilets after a 12-hour shift was no picnic, but emotionally. Kneeling on kitchen floors while families who barely acknowledged my presence went about their comfortable lives. Dusting photographs of their vacations while I calculated whether I had enough left over for groceries that week. "I never asked you to do that," Anthony said, but his voice had lost its accusatory edge. "No, you didn't. You were 9. You shouldn't have had to ask, and you shouldn't have had to know." I set my teacup down, my hands steadier than they'd been in days. "Do you know what I gave up?" "Mom, I gave up dating. I gave up the book club I loved. I gave up my painting classes, my bridge group, my friendships. I gave up any chance of finding love again because every free moment, every spare dollar, every ounce of energy I had went to making sure you didn't feel the loss of your father in any way except emotionally." The truth was, I'd been lonely for so long I'd forgotten what companionship felt like. There had been men, good men, who'd asked me out over the years. David from church, who brought me soup when I had the flu. Tom, the pharmacist, who always remembered to ask about Anthony's report cards. But how could I date when I was working 3 jobs? How could I build a relationship when I had nothing left to give after providing for my son? "You went to Harvard," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Full tuition, room and board, spending money. Do you know how I paid for that? Student loans, I sold my engagement ring." The words came out flat, matter of fact, but they carried the weight of years of sacrifice. "Your father's grandmother's ring, the one that had been in his family for 4 generations. I sold it to a pawn shop on 5th Street for $8,000. I could hear Anthony's sharp intake of breath. He'd never known that. I'd told him the ring was in a safety deposit box, that I was saving it for his future wife. Another lie, another sacrifice he'd never had to acknowledge. I sold my mother's china, my grandmother's jewelry, everything of value I owned except the house. And when that wasn't enough, I mortgaged the house. Twice. The house your father worked 20 years to pay off, I put back into debt to fund your education. Mom, when you graduated with your MBA, I was so proud. So proud that I'd managed to give you the life your father would have wanted. And when you started your consulting business, when you said you needed help getting established, I was happy to help. When you met Chloe, when you said you wanted to propose, I bought the ring. When you got married, I paid for half the wedding because her parents said they couldn't afford the venue you wanted. Each memory was a weight added to a scale that had been unbalanced for far too long. The business loan I'd co-signed when his startup struggled. The down payment on their first apartment. The new car when Chloe decided the used one wasn't good enough for a woman of her status. For 26 years, Anthony, everything I've done has been for you. Every decision, every sacrifice, every penny I've spent has been with your happiness in mind. And Tuesday night, your wife called me useless. In front of strangers. And you said nothing. The silence stretched between us, heavy with years of unspoken truths and unacknowledged sacrifices. I didn't know, he whispered finally. You didn't ask, I replied, and that, perhaps, was the saddest truth of all. Anthony didn't call back for a week. During those 7 days of silence, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I lived for myself. I slept until 8 in the morning instead of jumping up to check if my phone had any messages from him. I made elaborate breakfasts. With fresh fruit and real butter, not the quick toast I usually grabbed on my way to whatever errand or favor he needed. On Thursday, I did something that surprised even me. I drove to the art supply store downtown and bought a canvas, paints, and brushes. The girl behind the counter, probably Anthony's age, smiled when she rang up my purchases. Starting a new hobby, she asked. Returning to an old one, I corrected her, and realized it was the first honest thing I'd said about myself in years. That evening, I set up my easel by the living room window and began to paint the sunset. My hands remembered the motions even after all these years, and for the first time since Harold's death, I felt something close to peace. It was while I was cleaning my brushes in the kitchen sink that I heard them. Voices carrying from the courtyard below my apartment. My kitchen window faced the parking area, and I could see Anthony's BMW parked beside a silver sedan I didn't recognize. Told you this would happen, a woman's voice was saying. Sharp, irritated. Chloe. I froze, my hands still in the soapy water. They were directly below my window, probably thinking they were having a private conversation. She's just being dramatic, Anthony replied. She'll come around. She always does. Dramatic? Chloe's laugh was harsh. Anthony, she canceled $9 million. $9 million. Do you have any idea what that house means to me? What it represents? I found myself leaning closer to the window, straining to hear every word. We'll find another house, Anthony said, but he sounded less certain than usual. That's not the point. Chloe's voice was rising, losing the careful modulation she used when others were around. The point is that your pathetic mother finally grew a spine. Do you know how long I've been waiting for this to happen? Pathetic mother. The words hit me like ice water. Chloe, don't what? Tell the truth? I've been watching you dance around that woman for 3 years, Anthony. 3 years of listening to you make excuses for why we can't set boundaries. 3 years of pretending to be grateful when she throws money at us like we're some charity case. She's not throwing money at us. She's helping because she loves us. She's buying us, Chloe snapped. There's a difference. And frankly, I'm sick of being purchased by a woman who hasn't had a life of her own since the Stone Age. My legs felt weak. I gripped the edge of the sink, my wet hands leaving marks on the clean counter. That's harsh, Anthony said, but his tone was uncertain, not defensive. Is it? When's the last time she had a boyfriend? A hobby? A friend who wasn't us? She's built her entire existence around being needed by you, and it's suffocating. Honestly, Anthony, it's embarrassing. Embarrassing. I pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart race. My mother worked 3 jobs to put me through college, Anthony said, but even I could hear how weak his protest sounded. And she's been holding that over your head ever since, Chloe replied. Don't you see? She created a situation where you could never leave, never be independent, never make a decision without considering how it would affect poor, sacrificing Pamela. The casual cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This was my daughter-in-law, the woman I'd welcomed into our family. The woman I'd tried so hard to love. She's lonely, Anthony said. Since Dad died, we're all she has. That's not our problem. That's her problem. And instead of building her own life, she's been parasitically feeding off ours. Parasitically. The word echoed in my mind, sharp and poisonous. She's never asked for anything from us, Anthony protested, though his voice lacked conviction. Oh, please. She doesn't have to ask. She just shows up with that martyred look, writing checks and making little comments about how happy she is. To help, how families should stick together. It's emotional manipulation, Anthony. Textbook. I found myself thinking about every visit I'd made to their house, every dinner where I'd picked up the check, every gift I'd brought. Had I really been manipulative? Had my love looked like control? She canceled the transfer, Anthony said after a long moment. Maybe she's finally ready to let go. Or maybe she's throwing a tantrum because I finally called her out on Tuesday night. Either way, we need to be smart about this. What do you mean? I mean we need to make sure she doesn't cut us off completely. Your inheritance is still tied up in her accounts, Anthony. The house, the investments, everything your father left is still in her name. My blood ran cold. They weren't just talking about the house transfer. They were talking about Harold's entire estate. She wouldn't she? She just canceled $9 million over a dinner conversation. What makes you think she won't change her will next? There was a long silence. When Anthony spoke again, his voice was different. Calculating. So what do you suggest? We play the long game. You apologize, make her think you understand her side. Maybe we even let her help with something small, make her feel needed again. But we're more careful about what we say in front of her. And then? Then we wait. She's 64, Anthony. How much longer can it really be? The callousness of it took my breath away. They were talking about waiting for me to die. Jesus, Chloe. Don't, Jesus, Chloe, me. I'm being practical. Your mother has controlled your life for 30 years. It's time you started thinking about our future instead of her feelings. I heard car doors slam, engine start. From my window, I watched them drive away, their taillights disappearing into the darkness. But their words remained, echoing in my small kitchen like accusations I couldn't escape, parasitically feeding off their lives. Emotional manipulation. Pathetic mother. I walked to my bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. Same silver hair, same worried eyes, same face that had been kissing Anthony goodnight for 35 years. But for the first time, I tried to see myself through Chloe's eyes. Was she right? Had I been so afraid of losing my son that I'd made myself indispensable? Had my love been genuine, or had it been a desperate attempt to ensure I'd never be alone? The questions hurt, but not as much as what came next. Because as I stood there in my bathroom, surrounded by the modest life I'd built for myself, I realized something that changed everything. I wasn't sure I could tell the difference anymore, and if I couldn't tell the difference between love and manipulation in my own heart, how could I expect Anthony to see it clearly? But one thing was crystal clear. Chloe had never seen me as family. She'd seen me as an obstacle, a problem to be managed until nature took its course. The question was, what was I going to do about it? 2 weeks after overhearing that conversation, I was sitting in Dr. Patricia Chen's office, something I hadn't done since the grief counseling sessions after Harold's death. The leather chair felt familiar yet foreign, like returning to a childhood home after decades away. What brings you here today, Pamela? Dr. Chen asked, her voice as gentle as I remembered. I'd been asking myself the same question during the entire drive over. What was I doing here? What did I hope to accomplish? I think I might have lost myself, I said finally. Dr. Chen nodded, making a note. Can you tell me more about what that feels like? I overheard my son and his wife talking about me. They called me manipulative. Pathetic. They said I was parasitically feeding off their lives. The words still stung to say out loud. And the worst part is, I'm not sure they're wrong. What makes you think they might be right? I stared out her window at the busy street below. People rushing to appointments, to lunch dates, to lives that seemed full and purposeful. When had I stopped being one of those people? After Harold died, Anthony became my whole world. Every decision I made was filtered through what would be best for him. I told myself it was love, but maybe it was fear. Fear of being alone, of being unnecessary. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. Tell me about the last time you did something purely for yourself. The question should have been easy to answer. Instead, I found myself reaching back through years of memories, searching for a moment that belonged to me alone. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. I started painting again last week, I said eventually. For the first time since Anthony was small. How did that feel? Like coming home, I admitted. But also like betraying him somehow. Like I was being selfish. Pamela, do you think painting is selfish? No, but I struggled to find the words. If I'm painting, I'm not thinking about Anthony. I'm not planning how to help him or worrying about his problems. I'm just existing for myself. and that feels wrong? It feels unfamiliar. Dr. Chen made another note. You mentioned that you've been financially supporting your son and his wife. Can you tell me about that? For the next 40 minutes, I laid out the pattern of my life since Harold's death. The jobs, the sacrifices, the endless stream of checks written for other people's dreams. As I spoke, I could see Dr. Chen's expression shifting subtly. Pamela, she said when I finished, I want you to try something. I want you to imagine that a friend came to you and told you this exact story. What would you tell her? I closed my eyes and tried to see my situation through someone else's perspective. What would I say to Martha from church if she told me her daughter-in-law called her useless? What would I tell my old friend Susan if her son only called when he needed money? I'd tell her to stop, I said quietly. I'd tell her she was being used. But you don't apply that same compassion to yourself? It's different when it's your child. Is it? Or is that what we tell ourselves to justify accepting less than we deserve? I left Dr. Chen's office with more questions than answers, but something had shifted. For the first time in years, I'd spoken about my life without making excuses for anyone else's behavior. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I went to dinner alone at a nice restaurant downtown. Not the chain places Anthony and Chloe preferred, where the music was too loud and the portions too large. A quiet Italian place where the waitress called me honey and didn't ask where my family was. I ordered wine, good wine, and the sea bass, and I sat by the window watching people walk by. Couples holding hands, friends laughing together, elderly men reading newspapers in comfortable solitude. Life happening all around me, while I'd been waiting for permission to participate. My phone buzzed halfway through my meal. Anthony's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered answering. The old Pamela would have answered, would have dropped her fork and given him her complete attention. Instead, I turned the phone face down and took another sip of wine. The message notification chimed again an hour later, as I was walking to my car. Then again while I was driving home. By the time I reached my apartment, there were 4 missed calls and 3 text messages. Anthony, Mom, can we talk? Anthony, I know you're upset about the other night. Anthony, Chloe wants to apologize. I set the phone on my kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea. Only then did I call him back. Mom, finally. Anthony's voice was strained. I've been trying to reach you for hours. I was having dinner, I said simply. Oh. Was everything okay? You usually answer when I call. Everything was fine. I was enjoying myself. There was a pause, as if he wasn't sure how to respond to that. Look, Mom, about the other night at dinner. Chloe feels terrible about what she said. She was stressed about her parents' visit, and she didn't mean it the way it sounded. I said nothing, waiting to see what else he might reveal. She wants to take you to lunch this weekend. Make things right between you two. That's kind of her. I said, keeping my voice neutral. So you'll go? I'll think about it. Another pause. Mom, are you feeling all right? You sound different. I'm fine, sweetheart. Just tired. Okay. Well, call me tomorrow? We should talk about the house situation. Maybe we can work something out. Work something out. Code 4, convince me to reinstate the transfer. We'll see, I said. Good night, Anthony. I hung up before he could respond, my hands surprisingly steady. The next morning, I made a series of phone calls that would have terrified me a week earlier. First, to my financial advisor, Robert Martinez. Pamela, how can I help you today? I want to change my will, I said. And I want to move some assets into accounts that only I can access. There was a brief pause. Are you sure? This is a significant change from what we discussed before. I'm sure. Can we set up an appointment for tomorrow? Of course. Is everything all right? Everything's fine. I'm just making some overdue adjustments. My second call was to my lawyer, Helen Thornton. I made an appointment to review all the legal documents I'd signed over the years, particularly the ones that gave Anthony access to certain accounts. My third call was to a real estate agent. I'd like to look at condos, I told her. Something with a view. 2 bedrooms, modern kitchen. Budget is flexible. Are you downsizing? She asked. No, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. I'm upgrading. That afternoon, Anthony called again. This time, I was ready. Mom, I was thinking about our conversation last night. Maybe we got off on the wrong foot about the house transfer. If $9 million is too much, we could look at something smaller. That's thoughtful of you, I replied. So you'd consider reinstating some of the money? I looked around my small apartment, at the painting I'd started by the window, at the life I'd been living in the margins. Anthony, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me. Of course. If I didn't have any money to give, would you still want me in your life? The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know. Mom, That's not. Why would you ask that? Because I need to know. If I were just a woman who loved you, who wanted to spend time with you, who had nothing material to offer, would I still be welcome at your dinner table? You're my mother. Of course you'd be welcome. But his voice lacked conviction, and we both knew it. I'll call you later, I said gently. I have some thinking to do. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, watching the afternoon light move across my walls. Then I picked up my phone and did something I hadn't done in 30 years. I called an old friend. Janet Morrison, who'd been in my book club before I gave it up to work more hours. We'd lost touch gradually, the way friendships do when one person stops showing up. Pamela? My goodness, it's been years. Janet's voice was warm with surprise. Too many years, I agreed. Janet, I know this is sudden, but would you like to have coffee sometime this week? I feel like I owe you an apology. For what? For disappearing from your life without explanation. Janet was quiet for a moment. Then, how about tomorrow morning? There's a new place on Elm Street. We could catch up properly. I'd like that very much. As I hung up, I realized something important. I wasn't planning revenge against Anthony and Chloe. I wasn't even planning to cut them off entirely, at least. Not yet. I was planning to remember who I used to be, before I made myself small enough to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be. The question was, would there be room for them in the life I was about to reclaim? The lunch invitation came exactly as I'd expected it would. Chloe called on Friday morning, her voice saccharine with forced sweetness. Pamela, I hope you can forgive me for the other night. I was completely out of line, and I'd love to make it up to you. Could we have lunch at Le Bernardin tomorrow? Just us girls? Le Bernardin. The most expensive restaurant in the city. Of course she'd choose somewhere that would cost me $200 a plate, making her apology another expense I'd be expected to cover. That's very thoughtful, Chloe, I said. But I actually have other plans tomorrow. Oh. The surprise in her voice was unmistakable. When had I ever had plans that didn't revolve around them? Well, Sunday then? I'm busy Sunday too. Maybe next weekend? I'll check my schedule and get back to you. The silence stretched between us. I could practically hear her recalculating, trying to figure out this new version of me that didn't immediately capitulate to her wishes. Pamela, I really do want to apologize. What I said was inexcusable. Yes. I agreed simply. It was. Another pause. I hope we can move past this. Family is so important. Family. The word she'd never used to describe me before now. I agree, I said. Family should treat each other with respect. Of course. Of course they should. Listen, Anthony mentioned that you might be reconsidering the house transfer. I want you to know that whatever you decide, we'll understand. We don't want money to come between us. The lie was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired her skill. That's good to hear, I said. I'll talk to you soon, Chloe. I hung up feeling oddly calm. The old me would have been anxious, would have spent the day worrying about their feelings and planning ways to smooth things over. This me made myself another cup of coffee and called my real estate agent to schedule 3 more condo viewings. That afternoon, I did something I'd been avoiding for weeks. I drove to the cemetery where Harold was buried. I hadn't visited his grave since the anniversary of his death 6 months ago, and I felt guilty about the neglect. His headstone was simple, elegant. Harold James Mitchell, beloved husband and father. I'd chosen those words carefully, wanting them to capture the man he'd been before the cancer took him. I think I've lost our son, I said aloud, feeling foolish but needing to voice the words. Or maybe I never really had him. I can't tell the difference anymore. A warm breeze rustled the oak trees above me. I sat down on the small bench I'd had installed nearby and pulled out the letter I'd been carrying in my purse for 3 days. I'd written it the morning after my session with Dr. Chen, but I hadn't been ready to send it. Dear Anthony, I read aloud, my voice carrying over the quiet cemetery. By the time you read this, you'll have discovered that I've made some changes to my will and financial arrangements. I want you to understand that these changes aren't made in anger, but in love. Love for you, and finally, love for myself. I paused, watching a cardinal land on Harold's headstone. He'd always said cardinals were good omens. For 26 years, I've organized my entire life around your happiness. I told myself this was what good mothers do, what your father would have wanted. But I realize now that by trying to make myself indispensable to you, I've done us both a disservice. I've prevented you from learning to be truly independent, and I've forgotten how to be anything other than your provider. The cardinal flew away, but I continued reading. I'm not abandoning you. I'm setting us both free. Free from the expectation that love must always come with a price tag. Free from the resentment that builds when relationships become transactions. Free to discover if we can love each other simply for who we are, not for what we can give. A couple walked by, holding hands and carrying flowers. They nodded politely, and I nodded back, unashamed to be seen talking to my husband's grave. I've moved your inheritance into a trust that you'll receive when you turn 45. This gives you 7 more years to build a life based on your own efforts, not on expectations of my death. I hope that when you receive this money, it will feel like a gift rather than something you've been waiting for. My voice grew stronger as I reached the end of the letter. I'm starting a new chapter of my life, one where I'm not defined solely by being your mother. I hope you can be happy for me, the way I've always tried to be happy for you. I love you, Anthony. I always will. But I love myself too, and it's time I started acting like it. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in my purse. Tomorrow, I would mail it. Tonight, I would cook myself a nice dinner and finish the painting I'd started. What do you think, Harold? I asked, looking at his name carved in granite. Did I do the right thing? No answer came, but I felt lighter somehow, as if a weight I'd been carrying for decades had finally been lifted from my shoulders. My phone buzzed as I was walking back to my car. Anthony's name appeared on the screen, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel the familiar spike of anxiety. I didn't wonder what crisis needed solving or what check needed writing. I simply answered. Hi, sweetheart. Mom, are you free for dinner tonight? Chloe's making her famous lasagna, and we thought it might be nice to have you over. Her famous lasagna. The recipe I'd taught her during their first year of marriage, using ingredients I'd paid for while she complained that the kitchen was too small for proper cooking. That's sweet of you to ask, but I have plans tonight. Plans? The word came out sharper than he'd probably intended. What kind of plans? I'm having dinner with Janet Morrison. We're catching up after too many years apart. Janet Morrison? Mom, you haven't talked to her in decades. Exactly. Which is why I'm looking forward to tonight so much. There was a long pause. Is this because of what Chloe said? Because she really wants to apologize properly. We both do. This isn't about Chloe's apology, Anthony. This is about me remembering that I used to have friends. But family comes first, right? The question hung in the air between us, loaded with years of expectation and guilt. The old me would have agreed, would have cancelled my plans and driven over with a bottle of wine and a forced smile. Family is important, I said carefully. But so is having a balanced life. So is maintaining friendships and personal interests. So is not losing yourself completely in other people's needs. I don't understand what's happening to you lately, Anthony said, and for the first time, I heard genuine confusion in his voice. Not frustration or anger, but bewilderment. I'm remembering who I used to be, I said gently. Before your father died, before I made you the center of my universe. I used to be interesting, Anthony. I had opinions and hobbies and friends. I want to be that person again. You're still interesting, Mom. When's the last time you asked me about something that wasn't related to helping you or Chloe? The silence that followed was answer enough. I have to go, I said. I don't want to be late for dinner with Janet. But Anthony? I love you. That hasn't changed, and it never will. After I hung up, I sat in my car for a few minutes, looking out over the peaceful cemetery. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the grass. Tomorrow, I would start looking at condos with panoramic views. Next week, I would sign up for an art class. Next month, I might even consider the cruise to Alaska that I'd been secretly dreaming about for years, but tonight, I was having dinner with an old friend who remembered the woman I used to be before I forgot her myself. And for the first time in 26 years, that felt like exactly where I was supposed to be. My phone buzzed one more time as I started the car. A text from Chloe, we really hope you'll reconsider dinner. Family shouldn't let pride get in the way. I deleted the message without responding. Pride had nothing to do with it. This was about finally understanding the difference between love and obligation, between being needed and being valued, and despite everything, I felt hopeful. Because even if I'd lost my son somewhere along the way, I was finally finding myself. Again. 3 months later, I was standing on the balcony of my new condo, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and pink. The view was spectacular, 24th floor, corner unit, with windows that stretched from floor to ceiling. I'd bought it with cash, something that would have horrified the old me who hoarded every penny for Anthony's future emergencies. My easel was set up by the window, a half-finished landscape waiting for my attention. The art class had led to private lessons, which had led to my first gallery showing next month. Nothing grand, just a small exhibition at the community center, but the girl who'd given up painting 30 years ago to work 3 jobs would never have imagined this moment. My phone sat silent on the kitchen counter. Anthony had called less and less frequently since receiving my letter. The last conversation we'd had was 2 weeks ago, stilted and awkward, both of us dancing around the New boundaries I'd established. The doorbell chimed, interrupting my morning meditation. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I opened the door, Anthony stood there holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing the uncertain expression of a child who wasn't sure if he was in trouble. "Hi, Mom," he said quietly. "I brought your favorite. Hazelnut. Cream, extra shot." I accepted the cup, noting that he'd remembered correctly after all these years. "How did you get up here?" Mrs. Patterson from the 3rd floor recognized me in the lobby. She let me in. Of course she had. Mrs. Patterson had seen Anthony's picture on my refrigerator and probably thought she was being helpful. "Nice place," Anthony said, looking around the spacious living room with its modern furniture and carefully curated art pieces. Everything was new, chosen by me for me, without considering anyone else's preferences. "Thank you. I love it here." He walked to the window, taking in the view. "Must be expensive." "It is," I said simply, not offering the justifications or apologies that would have automatically spilled out before. We stood in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Then Anthony set down his coffee and turned to face me. "I got your letter. I assumed you would." The trust fund thing, that was unexpected. Was it? "You're 35 years old, Anthony. Most people your age don't have access to their parents' entire estate." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "I never thought about it that way." "I know. That's part of the problem." He sat down heavily on my new sofa, running his hands through his hair. "Chloe's furious." "I imagine she is. She thinks you're punishing us." I sat across from him, noting how different this felt from all our previous conversations. Usually, I would be anxious, worried about his feelings, ready to fix whatever was wrong. Now, I felt calm, centered, curious about where this conversation would lead. "What do you think?" I asked. Anthony was quiet for a long time, staring out at the view. "I think you're teaching us something we should have learned a long time ago." The admission surprised me. "Which is?" "That love isn't supposed to cost anything." His voice was barely above a whisper. "That family isn't supposed to be a business transaction." I felt my chest tighten with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe. Or the beginning of forgiveness. "Chloe and I are seeing a counselor," he continued. "Dr. Morrison recommended her after I told him about our conversation at the cemetery." "You went to see Dr. Morrison?" "Harold's old friend had been our family physician for years before retiring." "I was worried about you. The way you'd been acting, so different from normal. I thought maybe you were having some kind of breakdown." He looked up at me, his eyes reflecting a pain I recognized. "But he said you sounded like someone who was finally having a breakthrough instead." I took a sip of my coffee, savoring the rich flavor. When had I stopped drinking good coffee? When had I relegated myself to instant granules and generic brands? To save money for other people's luxuries? "The counselor made us write down everything you've done for us over the past 3 years, Anthony said. Financial support, gifts, time, energy. Then she asked us to write down what we'd given you in return. And my list was embarrassingly short." He met my eyes directly. "Obligatory phone calls. Holiday visits that felt more like duty than joy. Taking your help for granted and getting annoyed when you wanted to spend time together." The honesty in his voice was something I hadn't heard from him in years. "The worst part was realizing that I knew so little about your actual life. Your friends, your interests, your dreams that didn't involve me. I've been treating you like an accessory to my life instead of a person with your own." I set down my coffee cup, my hands trembling slightly. "Anthony, let me finish, please. I need to say this." He took a shaky breath. "When Dad died, I was scared. Terrified of being alone, of you falling apart, of our whole world collapsing. And instead of learning to be strong, I let you be strong for both of us. I let you sacrifice everything while I just took." Tears were streaming down his face now, and my instinct was to comfort him, to tell him it was okay, that I'd chosen to make those sacrifices. But I stayed seated, letting him feel the weight of his own words. "I never asked about the 3 jobs because I didn't want to know how hard your life was. I never asked about your feelings because I was afraid you might say you were struggling too. I let you sell your wedding ring for my education and pretended not to notice when you started wearing Dad's old college ring instead. You knew about the ring? I figured it out years later. But by then, I was too ashamed to bring it up. Too afraid of what it would mean if I acknowledged everything you'd given up." We sat in silence while the morning sun climbed higher, filling the room with warm light. Finally, Anthony wiped his eyes and looked at me directly. "I don't know if we can fix this," he said. "I don't know if I can become the kind of son you deserve after being selfish for so long. But I want to try. Not because of the money or the inheritance, but because I miss you. The real you, not the version of you that existed only to take care of me." "What about Chloe?" I asked. Anthony's expression hardened slightly. Chloe is going to have to decide if she wants to be part of a family or part of a transaction. The counselor made it pretty clear that her attitude toward you is problematic. And if she chooses the transaction? Then I'll have to decide what's more important to me. My wife's comfort or my relationship with my mother. He paused, seeming to gather courage. For what it's worth, I think I already know what the right choice is. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city where I'd spent so many years making myself smaller and smaller. Anthony, I want you to understand something. These changes I've made aren't about punishing you or teaching you lessons. They're about me finally learning to value myself. I know. I spent 26 years afraid that if I wasn't essential to you, you wouldn't want me around. But that kind of relationship isn't love. It's dependency. And it's not healthy for either of us. I do want you around, he said quietly. Not because of what you can give me, but because you're my mother. Because you're funny and smart and talented, and I forgot that somewhere along the way. I turned back to face him. I'm not going to go back to being your safety net, Anthony. I'm not going to write checks every time you have a problem or drop everything when you call. I understand. But I would like to try building a different kind of relationship. One where we both show up as whole people, not as roles we're playing. Anthony stood up and walked over to where I was standing. For a moment, I thought he might hug me, but instead, he gestured toward my easel. Can I see what you're working on? I led him to the corner where my painting waited. It was a landscape of the mountains where Harold and I had honeymooned, painted from memory and imagination rather than photographs. It's beautiful, Anthony said, and I could hear genuine admiration in his voice. I had no idea you were this talented. Neither did I, until recently. Would you? He hesitated, then seemed to gather his courage. Would you maybe like to have dinner sometime? Somewhere we could actually talk? About your art, your life, things that have nothing to do with me. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation. Or ulterior motives. But all I saw was a grown man trying to figure out how to have an authentic relationship with his mother for the first time in his adult life. I'd like that, I said. But not at Le Bernardin. He laughed, the first genuine laugh I'd heard from him in years. How about that little Italian place downtown? The one with the terrible acoustics but amazing bread? Marco's? I love that place. I know. I remember you mentioning it years ago, before. He trailed off, but we both knew what he meant. Before Chloe decided it wasn't upscale enough for our family dinners. Saturday at 7? I suggested. It's a date. After he left, I returned to my easel and picked up my brush. The painting was nearly finished, but something about the light on the mountains wasn't quite right. I mixed a new shade of gold, something warmer and more hopeful than what I'd used before. My phone buzzed with a text message. For a moment, my old anxiety spiked, wondering what crisis needed my immediate attention. Then I remembered, I didn't have to be anyone's emergency contact anymore. The message was from Janet, asking if I wanted to join her book club's trip to Napa Valley next month. I typed back immediately, count me in. As I returned to my painting, I thought about the woman I'd been 6 months ago. Tired, anxious, living in the margins of other people's lives. That woman would never have imagined standing in this beautiful space, planning trips with friends, preparing for her first art show. That woman would never have believed she could choose herself without losing everything that mattered. But as the morning sun filled my new home with light, as I added the final touches to a painting that existed purely because it brought me joy, I realized something profound. I hadn't lost anything that was truly mine to begin with, and what I'd gained, my self-respect, my independence, my sense of worth, was invaluable. The phone rang again. Anthony's name appeared on the screen, and, for the first time in months, I smiled when I saw it. Hi, sweetheart. Hi, Mom. I just wanted to say, thank you. For what? For loving me enough to stop enabling me. For choosing yourself. For showing me what real strength looks like. After we hung up, I stood on my balcony once more, breathing in the crisp morning air. The city stretched out below me, full of possibility and promise. Somewhere out there was the life I'd been too afraid to claim for myself. At 64, I was finally ready to live it.